Hi, this is Guy Wallace. I started in learning and development way back in 1979, and I semi-retired in 2023. But my current mission as a semi-retired L&D professional is to help enterprise learning and development organizations become more performance-based. Welcome to my podcast. This episode is about bookending educational content and making it performance-based instruction. To help ensure transfer and impact, I recommend that almost every set of generic learning, education, and even some communications be augmented with bookends for the learner prepared in advance by the L&D function or something that's prepared by the supervisor following some performance guide or job aid for creating customized bookends. You know those enormous libraries of content? Supposedly learning content? Yeah, especially for them. If you recall the old saw about presentations, you do 1, 2, 3. You tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. 1, 2, 3. With 1 being an advanced organizer of sorts, 2 is the generic non-performance specific content, the education or communications, sometimes called learning. And 3 being the practice with feedback and perhaps several rounds of that, plus debriefings and reflections. Your model, language, and configuration sequencing for all of that may differ, of course. Advanced organizers. These set the learner up for learning. For a module or a course or an entire path of learning to perform, hopefully. And not just a path of content stuff that's not authentic and then effective and efficient. Try to avoid that. Or some learning via social interactions with technology alone or with technology and others or just with others. There's many ways to do this, of course, the whole learning thing. It's important that you begin with the end in mind. Know the terminal learning objectives and how they relate to any terminal performance objectives. Of course, performance objectives should be determined first, and then the learning objectives. Debriefings. A favorite quote of mine from Tyagi from decades and decades ago was, "All learning happens in the debriefing." I really like that quote, for it's so true. If you don't consciously reflect on what you have learned, awareness, knowledge, and or skill, was it really learned? For recall, sooner or later? For applications, sooner or later? Can you reflect while doing more application exercises, practice with feedback, of what you're learning? Of course you can. More and more practice with feedback of greater difficulty and or different scenarios is critical, if that's reflective of the authentic performance context. Always authentic, of course, or why even bother? A couple of years ago, I put out a call to all learning and development content library providers. I said, your offerings, libraries of content covering knowledge and skills, SANs, outputs, and context, requires a far transfer effort for the learners, and will also require them to segue from that formal learning to some informal learning means, via trial and error learning or social learning, where they ask a neighbor or a coworker or somebody else. While that might ultimately be effective, it's not likely to be very efficient. Are you in a hurry? Is the learner? How about their management? You can do better. What can be done? What can you do? Well, bookends, for one. For the learner, prepare them in advance by the learning and development organization for key critical content, or by the supervisor following some performance guide or job aid for creating customized bookends that are authentic to their learners, their people's performance requirements back on the job. You can create templates to accompany each of your offerings that you would bookend your content for to help tremendously with improving the efficiency and effectiveness by making it nearer transfer. Prepare a simple job aid or performance guide for supervisors to help them prepare their people, the learners, beforehand and afterward to help ensure transfer and impact. Bookending on the front end, a template for advanced organizers. These set the learner up for learning. There are many ways to do this. You'll figure it out, and how yours differ from your competitors might give you an advantage in the marketplace. Begin with the end in mind. Performance required back on the job. Make sure that that's clear to the learner before they start learning. Create a template for defining the specific, authentic terminal learning objectives and exactly how they relate to any terminal performance objectives. Bookending on the back end, a template for debriefings and transfer planning. Again, that quote from Tyagi from decades ago, all learning happens in the debriefing. But it might be important that you provided sufficient practice with feedback, corrective feedback, and reinforcing feedback before you got into the debriefings and the reflections. Your template can help local management structure the back end for reflections and then the planning and executing the transfer back to the job, which might include additional practice with feedback on real work or last week's real work or some sort of simulation by the supervisor or someone else who can provide reinforcing and corrective feedback to encourage the learner to become a performer, especially when that's difficult. Why do this? Well, to help your generic content get real, get authentic, to improve transfer and impact. And isn't that reason enough? I've never been a fan of enterprise libraries of content, even before they were officially offered digitally, because they are offering generic content non-specific to the enterprise's processes or practices, and yes, they were offered pre-digitally, pre-internet. Now, I've appreciated that enterprise libraries of content are a thing, a big thing in fact, and have been for quite some time now. And that tide has washed up on our shores. It arrived a long time ago. I couldn't stop it, no one else could, and maybe that's okay. But maybe I've been wrong about them, those enterprise libraries of content. Perhaps they do have a role in preparing people for their job tasks back on the job. Perhaps they have a role to play in employee satisfaction. I've been working on reuse of performance-based instruction since 1981 when I was at Motorola. There I first learned about MRP, Materials Resource Planning, and then MRP2, Manufacturing Resource Planning, which later begat ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. In my support of my internal customers who were in manufacturing, materials, and purchasing clients, I learned all about reuse of components, of subassemblies, of products within systems. These concepts, methods, and tools were all due to the recent arrival of computers on the factory floor. Yes, I go back that far. When I first got to Motorola, there weren't computers out on the factory floor, but they were coming, and I was asked by my clients to provide instruction, training, which really was education on computers and what can they do and how might you think about using them. When I pushed back on my clients that I was all about training and not education, they told me that they did not know the applications for computers out on the factory floor, but they sure expected that people would figure it out. We just needed to prime the pump, educate the people about computers, and let them figure out how they might best use them back out on the job. It was an epiphany for me. It became apparent to me in serving the people in manufacturing, materials, and purchasing across 5 major business sectors at Motorola that there was a good portion of instructional content that could be shared, either shared as is or shared after slight modifications. That would all help people in their work processes, which were known by the quality movement as work streams and nowadays more popularly known as workflows. That started me on the road at Motorola to creating a method for performance-based curriculum architecture design, which of late I've been calling instructional architecture. I have an enterprise content architecture. Think of a file cabinet with 5 drawers. one for each tier of types of content. Tier 1, organizational orientations. Tier 2, performance orientations. Not training you on how to do the performance, but giving you an advanced organizer of what's that all about? What's in it for you? What's in it for the organization? What's in it for the other stakeholders? How critical is this? Etc. Tier 3 was enabling knowledge and skills. This is where all of your generic content would go. Tiers 4 and 5 were the how to apply whatever the content was. Tier 4 was shared content, because everybody needs to learn how to log on, everybody needs to know how to fill out an expense report, etc. But then there are those things that are unique to jobs or job families. Those would be covered in Tier 5. Unique performance. You can learn more about the ECA, my Enterprise Content Architecture, by searching on that, ECA, on my websites. And check the show notes for a couple of URLs to blog posts on the ECA. Let me wrap up here. If your generic content is not bookended with an advanced organizer on the front end, focused on where and how it applies in the learner's performance requirements back on their jobs, and then on the back end with sufficient practice with feedback, it's otherwise known as a content dump, micro, mid, or macro. And please remember, always adopt what you can and adapt the rest. This goes for the concept of bookending generic instruction as well. Thank you.